Hey there. Tonight, we slip past the tall gilded gates of a royal palace, through corridors hung with portraits of dead kings, into the quiet, watchful, slightly terrifying world of a Victorian court, where the most powerful woman on earth sits small and round and dressed in black, and a handful of well-born ladies spend their days standing very still, a few feet behind her, waiting. Tonight, you become one of them. A lady-in-waiting to Queen Victoria, the Indy of every great family in England. And, as you're about to discover, quite possibly the most exquisitely bored woman in the entire British Empire. Before we begin, take a slow breath, and if you genuinely enjoy these quiet journeys into the past, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly want to. No pressure here ever. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and what time it is for you. I always love picturing all of us, scattered across the world, settling in under the blankets together, drifting off to the same old stories. Now dim the lights. Sink into your pillows. Let your shoulders go heavy. And let's step gently into a single day in the life of a royal lady-in-waiting. A day spent closer to the throne than almost anyone alive, and yet, somehow, with almost nothing whatsoever to do. Congratulations. You have just been appointed to wait upon Her Majesty. The good news: this is one of the highest honors a woman of your rank can receive. The kind of position that makes mothers weep with pride and rival families sick with envy. You will live in royal palaces. You will breathe the same air as the Queen of England and Empress of India. Your name will appear in the court circular, the official record of who is attending Her Majesty, printed in the newspapers for all the world to admire. The bad news: you are, for all practical purposes, about to spend the prime years of your life standing in cold rooms, being quietly useful, holding things, fetching things, and above all waiting, which is, after all, right there in the name. They did not call you a lady-in-doing. They called you a lady-in-waiting, and they meant it with absolute precision. And yet, knowing all of this, the cold, the standing, the years of beautiful tedium, families across the kingdom schemed and angled and pulled every string they had to win this very position for their daughters and wives. Why? Because in your world, proximity to the sovereign is the purest form of status there is. To be of the Queen's household is to be marked, visibly, publicly, as one of the chosen few, your family elevated, your sister's marriage prospects improved, your name lifted above the thousands of other well-born ladies, who will never come within 100 yards of the throne. It opens doors. It confers a glamour that clings to a whole family for generations. A mother who placed her daughter at court had won a great game, and she knew it, and so did everyone who congratulated her through gritted teeth. The honor was genuine, and it was valuable, and it was paid for in exactly the currency you are about to spend: your time, your comfort, your freedom, and a good many of the best years of your one and only life. Everyone wanted it. Almost no one who had it found it quite what they had imagined. That, too, is one of the oldest stories in the world. But let's go back to the beginning, to the letter that changed your life. It arrived in a thick cream envelope, and your mother went pale when she saw the seal, and your whole household held its breath while it was opened. You have been invited, which is to say, commanded, for an invitation from the sovereign is not a thing one declines, to take up a position in the royal household. Perhaps as a maid of honor, if you are young and unmarried, one of the fresh-faced girls who attend the Queen and are paid a small salary and given the right to be called, charmingly, honorable. Perhaps as a woman of the bedchamber, or a lady of the bedchamber, if you are older and married and grander. Above you all sits the mistress of the robes, a great duchess, the most senior lady of the court. There is a whole delicate hierarchy of women around the queen, layered as carefully as her petticoats, and you have just been slotted into your exact place in it, and you will learn that place quickly, because everyone else already knows it better than you do. You do not, mercifully, serve every single day of the year without relief, for the work of attendance is arranged in rotation. The ladies take turns in what are called waits, periods of active duty of a few weeks at a time, after which another lady relieves you and you are free, for a spell, to return to your own home and your own life before your next turn comes round. This is the one great mercy of the system, the safety valve that makes the whole thing endurable. You serve your stretch in the cold gilded machine, counting down the days, and then you escape back into the ordinary warm world for a while, before the summons calls you back again. Some ladies, the grandest and most senior, were more or less permanently in attendance. The lesser ladies rotated through. And so your life takes on a curious double rhythm. Weeks of formal, frozen, ceremonial service at the side of the queen, then weeks of blessed liberty, back and forth, year upon year, never fully belonging to the court and never fully free of it. You learn to dread the approach of your waits, and to count the days until their end, and you learn, too, that the freedom tastes all the sweeter for the confinement that frames it. If you come to court young and unmarried, as a maid of honor, your situation has its own particular flavor, part finishing school, part gilded confinement, part marriage market conducted under the most watchful eyes in the kingdom. You are one of a small group of well-born girls, paid a modest stipend, given the courtesy title of honorable, and expected to be decorative, accomplished, cheerful, and above all spotless in reputation. For the court is full of eligible gentlemen, the equerries and grooms and private secretaries who serve the royal household, young men of good family doing their own attendance on the sovereign, and a posting as a maid of honor was, for many a girl, the place where a husband was eventually found. But woe betide the girl who pursued it too openly, or whose flirtation outran propriety, for here, of all places, every glance was observed and every step reported, and the queen took a close, and not always welcome interest in the romances of her young ladies, approving matches, forbidding others, presiding over the hearts of her household like a stern and sentimental aunt. Many a quiet courtship bloomed in those cold corridors all the same, a shared look across a tedious evening, a few words snatched on a garden walk, and many a maid of honor left the queen's service at last on the arm of a man she had met while waiting. It was, perhaps, the one genuine adventure the position reliably offered, that somewhere in all that boredom, love occasionally found a way. So you pack, and you say your farewells, and you travel to whichever royal residence the queen happens to be haunting that month, and there are several, because the court moves ponderously with the seasons, and you will move with it whether you like it or not. And you arrive, your heart fluttering, at a palace, and you are shown to your room, which is not, you note with a small private pang, especially grand. A lady-in-waiting is important, but she is also staff, and her quarters reflect it. Comfortable, yes, but modest, often cold, sometimes a long, dark walk from anywhere you actually need to be. And this is your first small lesson, the first gentle puncturing of the dream. For you had imagined something, hadn't you, on the journey here, something out of the storybooks, gilded rooms and brilliant company, the glitter of the most glamorous court in the world, your own life suddenly transformed into something grand and luminous. And here, instead, is a chilly bedroom at the end of a long corridor, and a list of rules, and the dawning sense that you have arrived not at a perpetual ball, but at a place of work, exacting, formal, faintly austere work, performed in the presence of greatness, but consisting, mostly, of patience. The glamour is real, but it belongs to the institution, not to you. You are here to serve it, not to bask in it. The sooner you understand that, the kinder your years here will be. The ladies who arrived expecting a fairy tale were the ones who suffered most. The ones who understood, from that first cold evening, that they had taken a position, a job, with duties and discipline and a great deal of standing, fared far better. Which kind you will be, you do not yet know. But the palace will find out soon enough. And then, almost before you have unpacked, your education in the rules begins. And oh, there are rules. The court of Queen Victoria runs on etiquette the way a clock runs on springs. Wind it tight, and never, ever let it stop. First, and most absolute, you do not speak to the Queen unless the Queen speaks to you first. You do not begin a conversation. You do not offer an opinion unasked. You wait. There is that word again, for her to address you, and then you answer, briefly, correctly, and you do not prattle on. Second, you do not sit in the Queen's presence unless she expressly permits it, and she very often does not, which means that you may stand, for hours, through long dinners and longer evenings, your feet aching, your back screaming, your face arranged into an expression of serene attentiveness, because the Queen is not tired, and therefore, officially neither are you. Ladies of the court were known to grow faint from the sheer endless standing, and still they stood, because to sit unbidden was unthinkable. And third, the rule that governs how you move through every room she is in. You must never turn your back on the Queen. Never. To leave her presence, you withdraw, backwards, retreating in reverse across the floor, managing your skirts blind, your eyes lowered respectfully, feeling for the door behind you, until you are out of the room. It is exactly as awkward as it sounds, and you will do it dozens of times a day, and you will become, in time, eerily skilled at walking backwards, which is not a talent you ever expected to develop, and not one that will be of the slightest use to you anywhere else on earth. You learn the curtsy, of course, the deep, correct, royal curtsy, performed every time the Queen enters or leaves, performed until your knees develop opinions of their own. You learn how to address her, Your Majesty, the first time. Ma'am! Thereafter, to rhyme with jam, never with palm, a small distinction that the whole court will silently judge you on. You learn the precedence, who walks before whom, who is served first, who may sit when, the entire invisible architecture of rank that governs every meal and every procession and every passage through a doorway, and which is enforced not by the Queen, who barely thinks about it, but by the other ladies, who think about it constantly. And you learn what to wear, which is its own demanding science. Court dress is prescribed in detail, the correct gowns for the correct occasions, the trains, the gloves, the feathers and veils for the great formal drawing rooms, the jewels appropriate to your rank and never grander. But above all, at Victoria's court, you learn the rules of mourning, because the Queen lives in perpetual black and her household must dress to match her grief. For much of her reign the court is in mourning of one degree or another, deep mourning, then second mourning, then half mourning in shades of gray and mauve, and the death of any royal relative, anywhere in the vast web of Victoria's European family, can plunge the whole household back into black at a stroke. You keep a wardrobe ready for it. You learn the precise meanings of the colors and the fabrics, the dull crepe of deepest grief, the jet beads that catch no light. A lady-in-waiting's clothes are not an expression of herself. They are a uniform of service and sorrow, regulated from above, and you wear them, day after somber day, as the outward sign that your time and even your appearance now belong to the crown. There is also the royal family itself to navigate, the grown children, the swarming grandchildren, the visiting relations from half the courts of Europe. You may find yourself attending a princess, or helping to mind the royal little ones, or making careful conversation with some foreign highness whose language you barely speak. The queen's family is large, fractious, and intricately connected, full of old wounds and delicate alliances, and a lady-in-waiting must move among them with perfect discretion, taking no sides, carrying no tales, remembering always that today's quarreling relatives may be tomorrow's kings and queens. It is one more layer of watchfulness in a life made entirely of watchfulness. And then there is the matter of the queen herself, for she is not an abstraction, but a living woman, small and stout and watchful, and learning to read her is the truest skill of your whole position. She is, by turns, kind and severe, warm and glacial, and the weather of her moods governs the climate of the entire household. When she is pleased, there is no gentler or more generous mistress. She can be genuinely affectionate to the lady she trusts, thoughtful in small ways, quick to ask after your family, capable of real tenderness. When she is displeased, a single look can freeze a room. That famous flat, unblinking stare, the lips pressed in, the air gone suddenly to ice. She does not shout. She does not need to. The whole machinery of the court is arranged so that her smallest wish has the force of law and her smallest frown the weight of a sentence. You learn to watch her face the way a sailor watches the sky. She is a creature of iron habit, and her habits become the architecture of your days. She rises, she breakfasts, she works at her boxes, she drives out, she dines, she sits through the evening, all of it at more or less the same hours, in more or less the same way, year upon year, with the changeless regularity of a planet in its orbit. She keeps the rooms cold, and the windows open, and the fires low. She likes plain food and simple Highland pleasures, and the company of her dogs, of whom she is genuinely fond, often more visibly than of the grand people around her. She has a surprisingly hearty laugh when something truly amuses her. For all the legend of the unsmiling queen, those who knew her spoke of real warmth and real humor beneath the formality. The famous phrase attached to her, "We are not amused," may never have been said at all, or said in jest, but it has stuck, because it captures the thing every lady-in-waiting learns to dread, the moment when the queen's mood turns, and the temperature of the whole court drops with it. To serve her well is to anticipate that turn before it comes, and to be, always, exactly what she needs you to be in any given hour: a quiet presence, a steady hand, an attentive ear, a piece of the comfortable, predictable world she has built around her grief. And yet, and this is the part the dreary catalogue of rules and cold and boredom can never quite capture, a real bond could grow, over the long years, between the queen and the women who served her closest. She was lonely, profoundly so, for all her power, and a lady who attended her faithfully, who learned her moods and kept her confidences and simply stayed, year after year, could become something close to a friend, in the strange, lopsided way that a sovereign is permitted friends. Victoria could be touchingly grateful for steady kindness. She remembered the birthdays of those she loved, fretted over their illnesses, mourned them sincerely when they died, and showed, to the few she truly trusted, a warmth and a tenderness the formal court never saw. To be one of those few, to be genuinely valued by the most powerful woman in the world, not for your rank but for your faithful heart, was a reward that no salary could match, and some of her ladies treasured it above everything. The cage was cold, yes. But now and then, in the long evenings, a small fire of real human affection burned in it, and warmed the women who had given their lives to tend it. And then, your rules learned, your place assigned, your mistress studied, you begin the actual work. Which is where we must be honest about what a lady-in-waiting actually does all day, because the answer is one of the great quiet comedies of royal life. Very little, performed with enormous gravity, for an extraordinary number of hours. Your duties are real, but they are small. You attend the Queen, which means you are present, available, hovering at a respectful distance, ready to be useful the instant a use arises. You might carry her shawl, or fetch it when she feels a draught, which she frequently does. You might hold her bouquet, or her fan, or her little dog, or whatever small object she wishes to be momentarily free of. You write letters at her dictation, or answer the lesser correspondence on her behalf. You help to receive guests, standing in the correct spot, curtsying at the correct moment, making the correct light conversation with the correct people. You accompany her on her drives, sitting opposite her in the carriage, making gentle remarks about the scenery. You are, in essence, a piece of living, breathing, beautifully dressed court furniture, present, decorative, occasionally functional, and expected to be all three without ever once appearing bored. And here is one of the strangest things about your position, a contradiction you must simply learn to live inside. You are, at one and the same time, a great lady and a servant. By birth you are an aristocrat, one of the privileged few, accustomed all your life to being waited upon. And yet here, at court, you wait upon another, you fetch and carry and stand and attend, you order your whole existence around the needs of someone above you, exactly as a servant does. The difference between you and the housemaid who lights the fires is real, and the whole court is exquisitely careful to mark it. But the underlying truth is uncomfortably similar. You have entered service. A grand, gilded, prestigious service, performed in silk rather than in an apron, rewarded with status rather than wages, but service all the same. Some ladies never quite made peace with that, the small daily indignities of being at another's beck and call after a lifetime of command. Others found a curious freedom in it, even a kind of rest, in having one's duties so clearly laid out, one's days so completely ordered, one's only task to serve well and ask no questions. Either way, you learn a humility that your rank never prepared you for. At the very top of society, you discover there is always someone higher, and at Queen Victoria's court, there is the highest of all, and you exist to smooth her path. Let's walk through one ordinary day, then hour by slow hour, so you feel the true shape of it. You wake early in your modest room, and your own maid helps you dress, for even a servant of the Queen has a servant of her own, and you go down to a quiet household breakfast among the other ladies and gentlemen, the talk low and familiar, everyone half listening for word of the Queen's mood that morning. Then you wait to learn whether you are wanted. Perhaps you attend the Queen's dressing, or sit with her while she takes her own breakfast and opens her letters. Perhaps you are simply on call, and you retreat to the ladies' sitting-room with your needlework and your book and the long ticking quiet. Mid-morning, the Queen settles to her boxes and her ministers, and there is nothing for you to do but wait, and write your own letters home, and watch the rain on the windows. Around the middle of the day there may be a drive, and you are summoned, and you sit opposite Her Majesty in the carriage making careful conversation about the weather and the views for an hour or two in the cold air. Then luncheon, eaten fast against the whisking away of the plates. Then more waiting, the long, dead afternoon, the slowest part of the day, when the whole palace seems to hold its breath and nothing whatsoever happens. You walk in the garden if you may. You doze over your embroidery. You long, quietly, for the evening, and then the evening comes, and you remember that the evening is the hardest part of all. You dress for dinner. You dine in your finery, and then comes the long after dinner sitting in the drawing-room, on your feet or perched on the edge of a chair, attentive, frozen, smiling, until at last, at 10, at 11, whenever it pleases her, the Queen rises, and everyone curtsies, and you are released to climb the cold stairs to bed, to sleep, and to wake and do the very same thing again tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that, for the length of your appointment. That is the rhythm. That is the whole of it. A handful of small duties set like little islands in a vast gray sea of waiting. And when at last you are released, there is the long walk to your room through the sleeping palace, and it is a strange and beautiful thing in its own quiet way. The great corridors stretch away in the dark, lit by a few low lamps, the portraits of dead kings and queens watching you pass from the shadows, your single candle throwing its small wavering circle of gold across the cold stone and the faded tapestries. The whole vast house is hushed and still, the fires banked, the servants long since gone to their attics, the Queen asleep behind her closed doors, with her photograph of Albert above the empty pillow beside her. Your footsteps echo softly. The old building creaks and settles around you. And for a few minutes, walking alone through that immense and silent grandeur, you are neither performing nor waiting nor watched, just a tired woman with a candle, making her way to bed through the heart of an empire, while half the world sleeps and the other half has not yet woken. It is, perhaps, the only truly private moment of your whole long day. And then you reach your cold little room, and your maid helps you out of your finery, and you climb beneath the blankets, and you let your eyes fall closed, knowing that tomorrow will bring the very same again, the waiting, the standing, the cold, the quiet, world without end, for as long as your service lasts. But the bored is the hard part, because for every minute of small usefulness, there are hours of pure unstructured, soul-testing waiting. You wait outside doors. You wait in anterooms. You wait while the Queen reads her dispatches, while she meets her ministers, while she naps, while she does any of the 100 private things a sovereign does that do not require a lady standing nearby. You sit with the other ladies in a designated room, doing needlework you do not care about, making conversation you have made 100 times, watching the long, slow clock of the palace tick away the best years of your life, listening for the bell or the message that summons you back to attend. The court of Queen Victoria was, by nearly every account of those who served in it, one of the dullest places in the entire kingdom, a hushed, slow, strictly regulated world where very little ever happened and every day was very much like the last. And you have just signed up to live in it. Consider the great ceremony of dressing the Queen, which is not your task alone. There are dressers and wardrobe maids for the real labor, but which you, as a lady of the bedchamber, attend and assist, hovering in the warm intimacy of the royal toilette. And here you learn that a queen, too, is assembled rather than simply dressed. The layers, the stays, the heavy mourning black, the widow's cap, the jewels chosen for the day, the whole slow architecture of turning a small, tired, grieving woman into the image of a sovereign. You hand things. You hold things. You offer the correct opinion when the correct opinion is requested, and no opinion at all when it is not. You see the Queen of England with her hair down and her guard lowered, which is a rare and strangely tender privilege, and you understand at once that to speak a word of it outside these rooms would be the end of you. Intimacy without familiarity, closeness without ease. That is the whole art of your position, and you practice it from the moment she wakes. Then there are the great set-piece occasions, when the hushed court suddenly fills and glitters, and you have actual work to do, the drawing rooms, the formal receptions at which young women are presented to the sovereign. You may remember being on the other side of that ordeal yourself, a trembling debutante in white feathers sinking into your curtsy. Now you stand among the attendants, near the Queen, watching the long line of terrified girls approach one by one, helping the great occasion run on its rails, a small fixed star in the ceremony rather than the anxious comet passing through it. You assist at the investitures, the audiences, the receiving of ambassadors, and the wives of the powerful. On these days the palace remembers that it is the center of an empire, and you, in your finest gown, are part of the machinery that makes the magic, present, poised, and almost entirely silent. And then the glitter recedes again, and you face the thing that truly tests the soul of a lady-in-waiting, the long royal evening. After dinner, the household gathers in the drawing-room, and there you remain, often for hours, in the Queen's presence, while almost nothing happens. She may have a lady read aloud to her. There may be a little music, kept low and grave to suit her mourning. There may be a quiet game of cards or patience. Mostly there is conversation conducted in murmurs, careful and circular, and long stretches of simply being there, standing or perched, attentive, while the clock crawls and the fire is kept deliberately too low and your feet quietly die inside your shoes. You may not yawn. You may not droop. You may not, heaven forbid, appear to wish yourself elsewhere, though you wish it with every fiber of your being. And you may not leave until the Queen retires, and the Queen retires when the Queen pleases, which on some evenings is not for a very long time at all. The whole court holds its breath each night, waiting for the small signal that releases everyone to bed. It is not all grayness, in fairness. There are bright moments scattered through the long calendar, and you learn to treasure them precisely because they are so rare. There are the great family occasions, the royal weddings and christenings and birthdays, when the hushed palace is filled with cousins and color and something almost like gaiety, and the Queen, for a day, sets aside a little of her sorrow. There is Christmas, which Victoria and Albert had made into a warm family festival of trees and gifts and German carols, and which the family still keeps with real affection. There are the Highland gatherings at Balmoral, the games and the dancing and the bonfires, where even the stiff court loosens for an evening into something genuinely merry. There are the jubilees, when the whole world seems to arrive at the door, and the old Queen is carried in triumph through oceans of her cheering people. On such days you remember why your family wept with pride at your appointment, for you stand at the very center of history being made, close enough to touch the great events that the rest of the world reads about in the papers. And then the guests depart, the decorations come down, the black is resumed, and the long gray rhythm closes over the court once more, and you take up your station, and you wait. By day, if you are spared the drawing-room, there are the drives. The Queen liked to take the air in her carriage, and a lady-in-waiting often rode with her, seated opposite, through the parks of Windsor or the hills around Balmoral. These outings sound pleasant, and the scenery often is, but they are work all the same. You must make gentle, suitable conversation, or hold a companionable silence, exactly as her mood requires, reading her wishes from the smallest signs, never tiring her, never boring her, never saying the wrong thing in the close confinement of a moving carriage from which there is no escape for an hour or more. And always, behind everything, runs the relentless paperwork of monarchy, the famous red boxes, the dispatches and documents that followed Victoria everywhere, that she worked through with iron diligence to the end of her life. You do not read state secrets, but you live alongside that endless river of business, fetching, carrying, writing the lesser letters, aware always that the small woman you serve holds threads that run to the far corners of the earth. There is, too, a detail nobody mentions when they congratulate your family on the great honor: the cost. For all its prestige, the position pays very little. A modest salary for the unmarried maids of honor, often little or nothing for the grander married ladies, for whom the honor itself is supposed to be reward enough. And meanwhile you must dress the part, day after day, in the gowns and the jewels that life at court demands, an expense that falls largely on you and your family. Many a lady-in-waiting found that the proudest position in the land was also a quiet drain on the purse, that one paid, in the end, for the privilege of being bored in the presence of greatness. The honor was real. So was the bill. And underneath it all lies the deepest cost of the whole arrangement, the one measured not in money but in years. For while you wait, your own life waits too. The seasons when a young woman might be courting, marrying, building a household and a life of her own, these you spend instead in attendance, your prospects on hold, your suitors kept at arm's length, your youth quietly spent in the service of another woman's days. Some ladies served for a few years and then left to marry. Others gave decades, growing gray in the cold corridors, until the court was the only life they had. You went in dreaming, perhaps, of romance and adventure at the glittering heart of the world. You found instead a great deal of standing, a great deal of silence, and the slow, strange discovery that the most exalted waiting room in England is still, in the end, a waiting room. And one day, of course, it ends. Perhaps you marry, and leave the Queen's service to take up a household of your own, your years at court becoming a story you tell, a faded honor you wear for the rest of your life. Perhaps you simply grow too old, or your health fails, or your turn in the rotation quietly ceases to come. Or perhaps you are among the faithful few who stay to the very end, who close the Queen's eyes at the last and walk behind her coffin, your whole adult life having been poured into hers. However it comes, the day arrives when you fold away the court gowns for the last time, when you make your final backward withdrawal from the royal presence, when the great gilded doors close behind you and you step out, blinking, into a life that is, at last, your own again. And here is the strange truth that so many of those women confessed in their letters and memoirs, that for all the cold and the boredom and the years given away, they would not have traded it. To have stood at the very center of their age, to have known the most powerful woman in the world as a living human being, to have been part, however small, of the great pageant of history, it marked them, and most of them, looking back, counted it the proudest thing they ever did. The cage was real. So was the privilege of having lived, however briefly, at the heart of the world. Take the matter of meals, which ought to be a pleasure, and is instead a small ordeal governed by one terrible rule. You dine at the Queen's table, or near it, a genuine honor, and then you discover the catch. The queen, by temperament and by habit, eats quickly. She works through her courses at a brisk, businesslike pace, and the moment Her Majesty has finished a dish, that course is over. For everyone. The footmen move at once to clear the plates, all the plates. Whether or not you have finished, whether or not you have so much as started. And since you have been busy being attentive, and since you eat carefully, in tiny ladle-like portions, mindful of your corset and your manners, you are very often only 3 bites into something delicious when it is whisked away from under your fork forever. The ladies and gentlemen of the court learned to eat fast, almost desperately, shoveling in what they could in the narrow window before the queen laid down her own cutlery and doomed them all. You will rise from many a royal banquet quietly, elegantly hungry. It is one of the great absurd injustices of palace life, to be starving at the richest table in the realm. And then there is the great shadow that lies over the whole court, the thing that colors every room and every day, the mourning. For you have come to serve a queen in grief, and her grief is not a passing season, but a permanent climate. When her beloved husband, Prince Albert, died, Victoria's world ended, and she never truly let it begin again. For years, she withdrew almost entirely from public life. She wore black, deep unrelieved black, for the rest of her days, decades of it. And she required her court to live inside that grief with her. The palaces became temples of mourning, hushed, somber, the gaiety drained out of them. Albert's rooms were kept exactly as he had left them, his clothes laid out, hot water brought each morning as though he might still rise and wash. And you, the lady-in-waiting, must move through this frozen sorrow with perfect tact, never too cheerful, never reminding her of joy, sharing in a bereavement that is not yours, in a house that has decided more or less to stop. It is a strange and heady thing, to spend your young years inside another person's endless winter. The cold is not only a matter of mood either. The queen, famously, could not abide stuffy rooms. She loved fresh air, cool air, cold air, with a passion bordering on the fanatical, and she had the windows kept open and the fires kept low even in the depths of an English or a Scottish winter. For her, this was bracing and healthful. For everyone obliged to sit in those rooms with her. For you, in your evening gown with your bare arms, hour after hour, it was an exercise in quiet suffering. Ladies of the court wore extra flannel beneath their finery, smuggled in shawls, pressed themselves toward whatever feeble warmth they could find, and shivered through the long royal evenings with frozen smiles, because if the queen was comfortable, then the question of anyone else's comfort simply did not arise. You are cold at Windsor. You are colder at Balmoral. You are, in a general way, cold for years. Ah, yes, Balmoral. Because the court does not stay put, and neither will you. Queen Victoria divided her life among her residences, and the whole apparatus of the court packed up and trailed after her as she went. To Windsor Castle, to Buckingham Palace when duty absolutely demanded the capital she disliked, to Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, by the sea, and above all to Balmoral, her beloved castle in the Scottish Highlands, far, far away from London and everything resembling excitement. The Queen adored Balmoral, the hills, the cold rivers, the simple Highland life, the bracing remoteness of it. Her court, on the whole, regarded a posting to Balmoral as a kind of beautiful exile, magnificent scenery, magnificent boredom, hundreds of miles from one's friends, one's amusements, and any version of society more lively than a damp walk and an early dinner. You will go where she goes. You will love the views, and quietly mourn your social life, and you will become very familiar indeed with the inside of a Highland drawing room on a rainy night. Each of her houses has its own character, and you come to know them all. Windsor Castle, the great ancient fortress, is the grandest and the most formal, the seat of 1,000 years of kings, magnificent and cold and heavy with history, the place where the most solemn business of the monarchy is done. Buckingham Palace, in the heart of the London she disliked, she used as little as she could. It stood for much of her reign half shut and underused, open mainly for the great ceremonies that duty would not let her escape. Osborne House, on the Isle of Wight, was the seaside retreat she and Albert had built together as a family home, an Italian-style villa above the sea, and it remained precious to her as a place thick with his memory. It was there, in the end, that she would die. And Balmoral was the soul's escape, the Highland idyll, the place she loved best and her court endured most. The royal year turned among these houses in a slow, fixed migration, and the whole vast household, the ladies, the gentlemen, the secretaries, the servants, the boxes, the very furniture of monarchy, packed up and moved with each season, a great caravan following this small woman in black wherever her restless grief and her iron habit carried her. You learn the train timetables and the packing routines as well as you learn the curtsy. You are, in a sense, always either arriving or about to leave. And wherever the court alights, the wider world keeps coming to its door, for you are at the nerve center of an empire that spans the globe. Ambassadors arrive to present their credentials. Foreign royalty, half of them the Queen's own relations, come to visit and be received. The wives and daughters of the powerful are presented. The endless ceremonial business of a great monarchy flows through the rooms where you stand and wait. You glimpse, at the edges of your duty, the machinery of world events, treaties and successions, the marriages that bind dynasties, the deaths that shift the balance of nations, all of it passing close enough to touch, and yet entirely beyond your power to influence. You hold the shawl of the woman at the center of it. That is your share of the empire, to be near, to be silent, and to be useful. It was at Balmoral, and everywhere else, that you would encounter the most talked about and least mentionable figure of the whole court, John Brown. Brown was the Queen's Highland servant, a gruff, plain-spoken Scot to whom she became extraordinarily, conspicuously attached in the long years of her widowhood. She trusted him utterly. She allowed him a bluntness no one else on earth would have dared. He was constantly at her side, and the closeness between the grieving Queen and her devoted servants set the whole country whispering, gossip, speculation, jokes too coarse to repeat, questions that have never been fully answered. And as a lady-in-waiting, you stand at the very center of all this, seeing it up close, day after day, and you must say nothing. Absolutely nothing. To gossip about the Queen, to carry tales out of the palace, to so much as raise an eyebrow at the wrong moment, would be the swiftest possible way to end your career and disgrace your family. You see everything. You keep all of it. Discretion is not merely expected of you. It is the entire foundation of your position. You become a vault. And what a great deal there is to keep! For from your place at the edge of the royal family, you see everything, not the polished public face the world admires, but the private truth behind it. You see the Queen's grief in its rawest, least dignified moments, the tears and the temper and the long black silences. You see the quarrels among her children, the favorites and the disappointments, the wayward heir and his wandering ways, the strained marriages and the family wounds that never quite heal. You see who is in favor and who is out, who is ill, who is in debt, who is in love where they should not be. You overhear the half-sentences. You notice the swollen eyes at breakfast. You catch the look that passes between two people who think themselves unobserved. A lady-in-waiting is among the most informed people in the kingdom about the inner life of its rulers, and she must carry all of it, every secret and every sorrow, locked away behind a serene and untroubled face, for the rest of her life. Some ladies, late in their years, set down a little of it in carefully discreet memoirs. Most took it all silently to their graves. To be trusted with the private truth of the most public family on earth, and to be worthy of that trust through decade after decade of temptation to gossip, that, in the end, is the real and quiet greatness asked of you. Not the curtsy, not the standing, the keeping. You are not, of course, the only one waiting. The royal household is a whole small society of attendants, and you live cheek by jowl with them through the long seasons. There are the gentlemen, the equerries and grooms-in-waiting, the private secretaries, the lords-in-waiting, performing their own male version of your duty, attending the queen on her drives and at her audiences, riding beside the carriage, managing the endless business of the court. There is the master of the household and his staff, who run the great machine of meals and lodging and logistics. There are the dressers and pages and footmen, the doctors always on call, the chaplains, the whole layered population of a court in perpetual motion. You take your meals with these people in the household dining room. You pass the idle hours with them. You come to know their characters and their grievances and their small intrigues intimately, for you are all, in a sense, fellow inmates of the same gilded institution, serving the same exacting mistress, counting the same slow hours. Friendships form, and rivalries, and now and then romances. The household is its own enclosed world, with its own gossip, and its own hierarchy, and its own weather. It can be a comfort, this company of fellow servants of the crown, the one warm, human, ordinary thing in a life otherwise governed entirely by ceremony. And it can be a cage within the cage, for there is no privacy in it, and every friendship is conducted under the same watchful eyes that observe everything else. And that, in the end, is the strangest weight of the whole life, the airless, total lack of any existence of your own. You are never off duty in any real sense. You are in waiting, on call, your time belonging not to you, but to the rhythms of another woman's day. You have almost no privacy. You see your own family rarely, snatching visits between attendances. The friendships you make are with the other ladies, in the strange hothouse intimacy of people thrown together in a gilded boredom, and among them, too, there is hierarchy and rivalry, and the careful management of who outranks whom, the mistress of the robes above the ladies of the bedchamber above the women of the bedchamber above the maids of honor, every kindness and every slight noted in the great unwritten ledger of the court. You write long letters home, describing the splendor and quietly confessing the tedium. And you watch your own youth, the years when you might have married, traveled, lived, flow past you in a series of cold, magnificent, identical evenings, spent standing a few feet behind the throne of the most powerful woman in the world. And there is a particular loneliness to it that no amount of splendor can ease. You are surrounded, always, by people, the queen, the other ladies, the gentlemen of the household, the endless stream of the great and the grand, and yet you are profoundly alone, for none of these relationships is truly your own. The queen is your sovereign, not your friend. The other ladies are colleagues in a strange, enclosed workplace, bound to you by circumstance rather than choice, and your real life, your family, your own heart's people, are far away, glimpsed in snatched visits and long letters. You give your days to the moods and needs of a woman who, however kind she may be, will never quite see you as a full person in your own right, because that is not what you are there for. You are there to smooth her path, to fill her rooms, to be reliably, invisibly present. And slowly you may feel your own self growing faint from disuse, your opinions unspoken, your wishes unconsulted, your whole vivid interior life folded away beneath the serene, attentive mask the court requires. Some women made their peace with it, even came to love the strange ordered life, the closeness to history, the small deep satisfactions of service well done. Others counted the cost in quiet desperation and longed for the day their attendance ended. Most, like most people in most lives, simply endured, and found what small joys they could in the cracks of the long days, a friendship with a fellow lady, a kindness from the Queen, a walk in a beautiful park, a letter from home read twice. For that is the paradox at the heart of your gilded position, and it is the same paradox that runs beneath every story this channel tells. You are closer to power than almost any woman alive. You touch the Queen's shawl. You hear the Empire's business murmured across the room. Your name is in the newspapers among the great. And you have, yourself, no power at all, not over the Empire, not over the court, not even over your own afternoon. You are honored and you are trapped, envied and exhausted, at the very summit of the world and entirely unable to leave the room without permission. A golden cage, with the best view in England. And you are only one in a long, quiet procession of them, the women who stood, across all the years of that long reign, a few feet behind the throne. Some came as bright young maids of honor and left as brides. Some came as great ladies and gave decades to the cold corridors. Some grew old in the service, their own lives folding silently into the Queen's. Their names are mostly forgotten now, footnotes in the court circular, faces at the edge of old photographs, but each of them was a whole person, with hopes and a heart and a life she set aside, hour by patient hour, to keep the most powerful woman in the world from being alone. There is a strange tenderness in that, when you think of it in the dark, all those years of quiet attendance, all that patience, all that waiting, given so that one grieving woman need never look up from her sorrow and find no one there. They were the soft human cushioning around a hard and lonely throne. History scarcely remembers them. But they were there, every long evening, in the cold, keeping watch. And you are far from the first to walk this path, nor will you walk it alone. The ladies of Victoria's court were real women, and a number of them left letters and diaries that survive. And from those private pages we know exactly how the life felt from the inside, because they wrote it down, candidly, to their families and friends, in the long idle hours when there was nothing else to do. They wrote of the deadening boredom and the bitter cold, of the kindness the Queen could show and the sudden chill of her displeasure, of the strange, hushed, clockwork days, of how they counted down their weeks of duty like a sentence to be served, and how they longed, even amid all the splendor, simply to go home. Some served only a season or two. Others gave the better part of their lives. There were ladies who attended Victoria faithfully for decades, growing old beside her, becoming part of the very furniture of the reign, their own youth and middle age folded quietly into hers. They are a small sisterhood across the years, these women who stood and waited, and their letters whisper the same thing down to us, that it was the greatest honor of their lives, and that it was, very often, almost unbearably dull. You learn their survival tactics, pass quietly from one lady to the next. You learn to wear warm flannel beneath your evening silk and to position yourself, when you can, nearest whatever small heat a room offers. You learn to eat quickly and early when you get the chance, so the whisking away of the royal courses cannot leave you faint. You learn to stand with your weight shifting imperceptibly from foot to aching foot, to keep your face serene, while your mind wanders far away, to doze, almost, with your eyes open through the longest evenings. You learn precisely how much you may say, and to whom, which of the other ladies can be trusted with a confidence, and which cannot, where the few moments of real freedom hide in the rigid timetable of the day. It is an education in patience, in self-effacement, in the quiet art of being splendidly, decoratively present while your own self waits somewhere just out of sight. And whether it makes you bitter or serene depends, in the end, entirely on you, for the court will not bend to suit your temperament. You must bend, every day, to suit its own. So that is a day, a year, in the life of a lady-in-waiting to Queen Victoria. And the truth is, you wouldn't last one, not the standing, not the cold, not the whisked-away dinners, not the years of beautiful, suffocating waiting. We look at those serene women in the old court photographs, posed at the edge of history, and we think how grand it must have been. We forget that each one was a real woman, giving up her own life, hour by silent hour, to stand at the edge of someone else's. Now let the candlelight blur a little, and let's step gently from the cold corridors of the court into the lives of three women who lived at its very center. Not the ladies who waited, but the royal women they waited upon, and around. For if the lady-in-waiting lived in a gilded cage, then the women at the heart of the court lived in the most gilded cages of all, and theirs, you will find, were no easier to bear for being made of finer gold. A queen, a future queen, and a princess, the most powerful, the most adored, and the most rebellious, each of them watched by the world, hemmed in by duty, and quietly, privately longing, like every soul in this story, for a little more room than her station would allow. 3 real lives, lit from within, to carry you down towards sleep. Long before she was Queen of the United Kingdom and Empress of India, before she gave her name to an entire age, before she became the small unsmiling woman in black whose court you have just suffered through, she was simply Dina, a lonely, watched, carefully guarded little girl named Alexandra Victoria, growing up in a single set of rooms in Kensington Palace, with no friends her own age, no father, and a childhood so strange and so confined that it makes the rest of her astonishing life suddenly make sense. She was born in 1819, and her father, a son of the old mad King George III, died before she was a year old. That left her a small girl with a very large destiny, for as the years passed and her royal uncles failed to produce surviving legitimate heirs, it became clear that this one child stood next in line to the throne of the most powerful nation on earth, and a child that valuable must be protected, or, depending on how you look at it, controlled. Her mother, the Duchess of Kent, and her mother's ambitious adviser, a man named Sir John Conroy, raised her under a suffocating set of rules that came to be called the Kensington system. Little Victoria was never, for a single moment, alone. She slept every night in her mother's bedroom. She could not walk down a staircase without an adult holding her hand. She was kept apart from other children, watched constantly, managed, isolated, the whole apparatus designed to keep her dependent and pliable, so that those around her might rule through her when her day came. She grew up, in other words, inside a cage of her own, which is perhaps why, when at last the door opened, she walked through it so decisively and never looked back. The door opened in the small hours of a June morning in 1837. Her uncle the king was dead, and they came to wake her, and she came down, 18 years old, her hair loose, in her dressing gown, to be told that she was queen. And the very first thing she did, that first morning, was ask for 1 hour entirely alone. After 18 years of never being alone for a moment, the new Queen of England requested a single solitary hour, and got it. And then she moved her bed out of her mother's room. The cage was over. That same first day, she walked alone into a room full of the most powerful and experienced men in the kingdom, her privy council, gray-haired statesmen and dukes and bishops twice and 3 times her age, and presided over them with a calm, clear, quiet composure that left them astonished. This tiny girl, barely grown, who had been kept so sheltered that she had scarcely met a stranger unsupervised, conducted herself before that formidable assembly with a self-possession that seemed almost impossible. They had expected a frightened child to be guided. They found instead a young woman who already, somehow, knew exactly who she was and meant to rule in her own right. It was the first public glimpse of the iron underneath, the will that would carry her through 63 years and never once truly bend. The long-watched, lonely childhood had not broken her. If anything, it had forged her, taught her patience, taught her self-control, taught her to keep her own counsel and trust no one too far. Everything they had done to make her pliable had, in the end, made her unbreakable. From that day, she would be managed by no one. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, young, and entirely untested, and the political men around her expected to guide her hand. They underestimated her completely. She had a will of iron, a temper to match, a clear, sharp mind, and an absolute conviction of her own right to rule. The girl who had not been allowed to walk downstairs alone now sat on the throne of an empire, and she rather enjoyed it. It is worth pausing on the woman herself, because the marble image of the dour old queen in black has buried the vivid, passionate, deeply human person underneath. We know her better than almost anyone of her century, for she kept a diary nearly every day of her life, from girlhood to old age, millions of words of it, and the private Victoria who emerges from those pages is a revelation, emotional, opinionated, easily delighted and easily wounded, capable of girlish glee and towering rage, a woman of strong appetites and stronger feelings who loved fiercely, sulked grandly, and recorded it all with disarming honesty. She adored music and dancing in her youth. She loved the theater. She felt everything intensely. She was stubborn to the bone and knew it. She could be petty, and she could be magnanimous, blinkered and shrewd, maddening and magnificent, sometimes within the same hour. She was, in short, gloriously, exhaustingly human, and the small woman you wait upon in the cold drawing-room, however frozen by grief, is all of that still, banked beneath the black like embers under ash. The man behind the Kensington system, Sir John Conroy, had expected to rule through her, to become the power behind a young and grateful queen. He got nothing. Victoria, who had watched him torment her childhood and bully her mother for years, banished him from her presence the moment she had the power to do it, and never relented. It was an early, ice-cold demonstration of a quality that would define her whole reign, a long memory, and an utter refusal to be managed by anyone she had decided to be finished with. Her poor mother, who had let Conroy run the cage, was kept at a frosty distance for years too, until Albert, in time, gently engineered a reconciliation. The first years were not all triumph. The dazzling girl made dazzling mistakes. There was the cruel affair of Lady Flora Hastings, a lady of the court whom Victoria and her circle wrongly suspected of being pregnant out of wedlock. The poor woman's swelling turned out to be a fatal illness, and when she died the young queen, who had helped fan the scandal, found herself hissed in public, her shine briefly tarnished by her own want of charity. There was the bedchamber crisis, a stubborn constitutional standoff, in which the young queen flatly refused to change the ladies of her household to suit an incoming government, and got her way through sheer obstinacy. She was learning, in public and not always gracefully, the terrible difference between wanting her own way and wielding power wisely. She was crowned in 1838 in a long, gorgeous, slightly chaotic coronation at Westminster Abbey, the ring jammed onto the wrong finger, an elderly peer tumbling down the steps, a small untested girl beneath the great weight of the crown, with an empire watching to see what she would become. For the first few years she ruled as a dazzling, headstrong young queen, delighting in her freedom, leaning on her first prime minister, the worldly and charming Lord Melbourne, who became a kind of father figure and tutor to her. Those first years were, in their way, the freest of her life. She had escaped the cage of Kensington. She was queen. She was young and adored, and she threw herself into the pleasures of her position with frank delight. The balls that lasted until dawn, the operas, the riding, the sheer giddy novelty of doing as she pleased after a lifetime of being managed. Melbourne, aging, witty, and a little in love with her in a fatherly way, spent hours at her side each day, teaching her the business of government and the gossip of the great world, and she hung on his every word. For a brief, bright season, the lonely girl was simply a happy young woman who happened to wear a crown. It could not last. A queen cannot lean forever on one charming minister, and her early stumbles taught her how unforgiving her position could be. But the memory of that freedom stayed with her, and perhaps made the long imprisonment of her later grief all the heavier by contrast. And then, in 1840, she did the thing that would define the rest of her life. She married. The man was her cousin, Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, handsome, serious, intelligent, high-minded, and German. And because she was the queen, and outranked everyone, it was she who had to propose to him, not the other way around. A reversal of the whole natural order of her age that she carried off with evident pleasure. She fell deeply, passionately, completely in love with Albert, and that love became the central fact of her existence. Together, Victoria and Albert did something subtle and enormous. They reinvented what a monarchy could be. The kings before her had often been scandalous, dissolute, mocked. Her own uncles were bywords for extravagance and vice. Victoria and Albert offered the nation something startlingly new, a royal family that was respectable, hard-working, devoted, and domestic, a model of exactly the earnest virtues the rising middle classes prized. They made a cult of family life. They popularized, among much else, the German Christmas tree, until the image of the royal family gathered around their candlelit tree, printed in the illustrated papers, taught a whole nation how to keep Christmas. They posed for the new art of photography as an ordinary loving family writ large, the devoted wife, the wise husband, the ring of healthy children. It was, in part, a performance, and a brilliant one. It bound the throne to the affections of its people in a way that mere grandeur never could. And it was also, for a time, genuinely true. The serious prince and the passionate queen really did love each other, really did labor side by side over the business of the realm and the raising of their children, really did build the thing they were also selling. It was not, at first, an easy partnership. Albert arrived a foreigner, distrusted, with no clear role, the mere husband of a reigning queen in an age that had no idea what to do with such a creature. But he was gifted, tireless, and serious-minded, and bit by bit Victoria came to rely on him for everything, not only love, but counsel, organization, judgment. He effectively became her private secretary and her partner in rule. They worked side by side at adjoining desks, and his steady, methodical, and probing influence shaped her reign and, through it, the age. Together they had 9 children, a vast brood that Victoria regarded with a famously mixed eye. She found pregnancy tiresome, infancy frankly unappealing, and the whole business of childbearing a regrettable interruption, even as she and Albert built the very image of the devoted royal family that would define respectable Victorian life. Those 9 children would marry into the royal houses of Europe until Victoria became the grandmother of the continent, her descendants seated on half its thrones, a web of cousins that would one day, tragically, find themselves on opposing sides of a world war. She carried, too, without knowing it, a darker inheritance, the gene for hemophilia, the bleeding disease, which she passed down through her daughters into the royal families of Spain, Germany, and Russia, where it would haunt the doomed family of the last Tsar. As a mother she was, by all accounts, a complicated and often difficult one. She had not greatly enjoyed the small children who arrived in such number, and as they grew she ruled over them with the same iron will she turned on her ministers, managing their marriages, their households, their movements, well into their own middle age, reluctant ever to loosen her grip. She quarreled with her heir, Bertie, whose pleasure-loving ways appalled her, and whom she blamed, unfairly and lastingly, for contributing to Albert's death by the worry he caused. She leaned hard on her daughters, and resented their leaving. And yet she was bound to them all by fierce, possessive love, and through their marriages she wove herself into the fabric of Europe until she truly was its grandmother, her descendants seated on the thrones of Germany, Russia, Spain, Greece, and beyond, a great-grandmother of the continent who would, within a generation of her death, see those very thrones turned against one another in the cataclysm of the First World War. The cozy royal family she and Albert had built became, in time, the tangled royal family of Europe, and its quarrels became the quarrels of nations. Albert's great public triumph came in 1851, when he drove forward the Great Exhibition, that vast celebration of industry and invention housed in the glittering Crystal Palace, a wonder of glass and iron that drew millions of visitors and announced Britain to the world as the workshop of the age. It was Albert's vision, and its success vindicated him at last in the eyes of a country that had been slow to warm to the foreign prince. Those were the golden years of the marriage and the reign, the serious, improving, hard-working royal couple at the head of a confident, expanding nation, the very picture of Victorian earnestness and progress. There were dangers, too. More than once in her long life Victoria was shot at by would-be assassins as she rode out in her carriage, and each time she displayed a cool, almost defiant courage, insisting on driving out again at once to show her people she would not be cowed. The small woman had nerve to spare. And then, in 1861, it all came crashing down. Albert, overworked, run down, only 42, fell ill and died, most likely of typhoid. And Victoria's world simply ended. The grief that took her was total, and it was permanent. She was 42 years old, and she would live another 40 years, and she spent a great deal of them in deep, unyielding mourning for the husband she had adored. The depth of it is hard to overstate, and to modern eyes it can seem almost unhinged. But to her, it was simply love that refused to die with its object. She had his rooms kept exactly as they had been, his clothes laid out fresh each evening, hot water, and a clean towel brought to his washstand every single morning for years, as though the dead prince might at any moment return to dress. She slept with a photograph of him, taken on his deathbed, hung above the empty side of her bed, and a cast of his hand within her reach. She wore mourning black, unbroken, for the remaining 40 years of her life, and required black or muted colors of her household. She had memorials to him raised across the kingdom, and turned the houses they had shared into shrines. She poured her grief into 1,000 rituals of remembrance, and she would not, could not, let go. It was love, and it was also a kind of imprisonment, self-built, the cage of a heart that simply refused to accept that the one great happiness of its life was truly over. And into that cage, day after cold day, she summoned her ladies-in-waiting to keep her company in the dark. She withdrew almost entirely from public view. She wore black for the remaining 4 decades of her life. She kept Albert's rooms as a shrine, his things untouched, and she retreated to Windsor and Balmoral and Osborne, away from the London she had never liked, earning herself a new and not entirely affectionate nickname, the Widow of Windsor. For years her subjects barely saw her, and grumbled, and some began to wonder aloud what the point of an invisible queen might be. This is the Victoria whose frozen, grieving court you have been serving in tonight. A woman encased in sorrow, turning the whole apparatus of monarchy into a monument to a dead man. The cost of that long withdrawal was nearly catastrophic. A monarch who will not be seen begins, in the public mind, to seem pointless, and through the 1860s and into the 1870s a genuine current of Republican feeling stirred in the country. Pamphlets and meetings and open questions about whether an invisible, expensive queen was worth the keeping at all. She was criticized in the press, lampooned, urged endlessly to come out of her mourning and do her duty, and she resisted, with the same iron stubbornness she had shown Conroy, insisting that her grief was sacred and her health too fragile and her dead husband's wishes paramount. It was, by any measure, a dangerous moment for the throne. What saved it, in the end, was a mixture of things: the patient coaxing of clever ministers, a wave of public sympathy when the Queen herself fell ill, the near death and recovery of her son Bertie from typhoid, which moved the nation, and the slow, grudging re-emergence of the Queen into public life. The monarchy survived its lowest ebb in her century, and went on to its greatest heights, but it was a closer-run thing than the cheering jubilee crowds of later years would ever have guessed. In those long gray years it was the gruff Highland servant John Brown who, more than anyone, drew her back toward life, blunt, fearless, devoted, treating her as a woman and not only a queen, and scandalizing the country with the closeness between them. And slowly, very slowly, the Queen re-emerged. Her clever Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli flattered and coaxed her back toward her public duties, and in 1876 he gave her a magnificent new title that delighted her, Empress of India. It was a piece of imperial theater, and she loved it utterly, for India was the great jewel of her empire, a vast and ancient land she would never see with her own eyes, but ruled over as empress all the same. 300 million subjects half a world away owing allegiance to the small woman in black at Windsor. The title bound her, in her imagination and the nation's, to the dazzling height of imperial power, and it drew her, by degrees, back out of the shadows of her grief and into the role of imperial matriarch that would define her final decades. The widow who had hidden herself away was becoming, almost despite herself, the living symbol of the greatest empire the world had ever known. Her relationships with her prime ministers became one of the great running dramas of her later reign, and they reveal the iron beneath the widow's weeds. She adored Disraeli, the brilliant, flattering, novel-writing conservative who understood that the way to manage this lonely, proud woman was through warmth and imagination rather than cold logic. He charmed her, wrote to her as a friend, laid the empire at her feet like a bouquet, and she loved him for it. She detested his great rival, the earnest, high-minded liberal William Gladstone, who, she complained, addressed her as though she were a public meeting, all lectures and principle, and not a drop of the personal warmth she craved. The Queen was supposed, by the rules of her constitutional position, to stand above party and treat her ministers impartially. She did no such thing in her heart, and not always in her actions. She schemed, quietly, against governments she disliked, and used every ounce of her influence, which was considerable, to favor the men she trusted. She was no mere figurehead. Behind the mourning and the seclusion sat a shrewd, opinionated, deeply political woman who had been reading the dispatches of state for half a century and knew the business of empire as well as any man in her government, and who never, for one moment, forgot that she was the Queen. For all her long withdrawal, she remained an extraordinarily hard worker to the very end, plowing through the red boxes daily, keeping up a colossal correspondence, missing nothing. The seclusion was real, and the grief was real, but so was the diligence. The empire's paperwork crossed her desk and got her full attention even when its people could not get a glimpse of her face. As the decades rolled on, the small woman in black became something extraordinary, no longer merely a monarch but an institution, a symbol, the still point around which a quarter of the human race seemed to turn. By her golden jubilee, and then her diamond jubilee in 1897, marking 50, and then 60 years on the throne, she was the most famous woman in the world, cheered by vast crowds, the living embodiment of an empire at its height, and of an age that already bore her name. In those last decades, she found another unlikely companion who scandalized the court almost as much as John Brown had. After Brown's death, the aging queen grew devoted to a young Indian servant named Abdul Karim, whom she called the Munshi, meaning teacher, for he taught her Hindustani and told her of India, the great jewel of her empire that she would never visit. She advanced him, defended him fiercely against a household that resented and despised him, and kept him close to the end, in the teeth of furious, prejudiced opposition from her own family and courtiers. It was, like so much of her late life, a story of a lonely old woman reaching past the cold formality of her court for someone who treated her simply as a person, and of a court that watched, appalled, and could do nothing. Her golden jubilee in 1887 and her diamond jubilee in 1897 were vast imperial spectacles, the streets of London packed with cheering millions, troops and princes drawn from every corner of the earth, the whole sprawling empire gathered to honor the tiny figure in black at its center. She was by then almost beyond a person, a living monument, half blind, lame, carried in her carriage through oceans of her own subjects, many of whom wept simply to see her pass. The girl who had asked for 1 hour alone had become the most recognized human being on the planet, the still heart of the largest empire the world had ever known. She died in January 1901 on the Isle of Wight, with her family gathered around her, after 63 years on the throne, the longest reign in British history up to that time. An entire world had grown up never having known any other monarch. When the news of her passing went out, the empire fell into a grief that was, for once, entirely sincere, for though many of her subjects had never glimpsed her, she had been the one fixed point in all their lives, the still center of a changing world, as permanent seeming as the seasons. Her funeral was a vast and solemn pageant. She had asked, characteristically, to be buried not in the heavy black of the mourning she had worn for 40 years, but in white, with her wedding veil, reunited at last with the Albert she had never stopped grieving, and beside him she was laid to rest. The age she had named was over, and the new century she barely entered would, within 14 short years, tear apart the comfortable royal world she had built. She had come to the throne a girl in a dressing gown asking for 1 hour alone, and she left it the matriarch of Europe and the symbol of an empire, having given her name to the century itself. And here is what to carry down into sleep with you. The little girl raised in a cage of rules grew into a woman who would not be ruled by anyone, and yet she spent half her own long life voluntarily locked inside the cage of her grief, surrounded by ladies-in-waiting standing patiently in the cold, keeping watch over her sorrow. Think of the shape of her whole long life. She began it watched and managed and never once left alone, a small girl who was not permitted to walk down a staircase by herself. She seized her freedom in a single morning and ruled half the world for 63 years, bowing to no one. And then, at the height of her power, she locked herself away inside her own grief for the rest of her days, and required a court of patient women to stand in the cold and keep her company there. Free and unfree, all-powerful and utterly bound, the most public woman alive, and one of the most hidden, she contained every contradiction this channel ever traces, written across the largest life of her age. The most powerful woman in the world, mistress of an empire on which the sun never set, and still, in the end, a heart broken by love and never quite mended. Power and confinement, splendor and loneliness, twined together to the very top of the world. Even a queen, it turns out, lives in a golden cage of one kind or another. Hers was just the largest one ever built. Long before she was Queen Alexandra, the beautiful, beloved, much photographed consort of King Edward VII, she was simply Alex, a cheerful, pretty princess from a small, poor, happy royal family in Denmark, who would marry the most spoiled prince in Europe, charm an entire nation, and bear, with a grace that bordered on the heroic, decades of public adoration and private heartbreak in almost equal measure. She was born in 1844 into the Danish royal family, but you must not picture wealth, because there was very little of it. Her father was a prince with excellent connections and a thin purse, and the family lived in modest, almost middle-class comfort, in a household full of children and warmth and homemade clothes. Alex and her sisters sewed their own dresses and shared cramped rooms. The family was close, affectionate, unpretentious, and genuinely happy in a way grander royal houses often were not. It was a childhood of real warmth and very little money, and it gave Alexandra something that all the gold of England never quite took from her: a simplicity of heart, an unspoiled, almost domestic ordinariness that the public would sense and adore in her for the rest of her life. The family was so prolific in marrying its children into the thrones of Europe that Alex's father, when he at last became King of Denmark, earned the nickname, the father-in-law of Europe, and his children were scattered to St. Petersburg and London and Athens, carrying that Danish warmth into the grandest and coldest courts on the continent. When Alexandra sailed to England as a bride, the country greeted the Sea King's daughter from over the sea with rapturous crowds, poems, and an outpouring of affection for the lovely foreign girl before she had so much as spoken a word. England had decided to love her before she arrived, and she spent the next 60 years giving it every reason to keep doing so. And yet her father's fortunes were about to change spectacularly, for he stood in line to inherit the Danish throne, and his beautiful, good-natured children would be scattered across the royal beds of Europe. One of Alex's sisters would become Empress of Russia, mother of the last Tsar. Alex herself was about to be chosen for an even more dazzling and far more difficult prize. Across the sea in England, Queen Victoria and the late Prince Albert had a problem, and his name was Bertie, Albert Edward, the Prince of Wales, their eldest son and heir. Bertie was charming, pleasure-loving, easily bored, and a source of constant despair to his serious-minded parents. They concluded that what their wayward son needed was a wife, a beautiful, virtuous, steadying wife who might settle him down. A discreet European search was conducted, candidates were assessed almost like livestock, and the choice fell upon the lovely young Danish princess. Bertie was introduced to her, found her genuinely beautiful and delightful, and agreed. And so in 1863, at just 18, Alexandra came to England to marry the future king, radiant, gracious, and walking, though she could not have known it, into one of the great trials of patience in royal history. Her arrival was a national event of extraordinary warmth. She sailed from Denmark, and was met by cheering crowds at every stage of her journey toward London, the streets lined with people straining for a glimpse of the lovely young foreign princess, who was to marry their future king. The poet laureate himself wrote verses to welcome her. Flowers were strewn, bells were rung, a whole country fell a little in love at first sight. It was, for a girl from a modest Danish household, an overwhelming and dazzling welcome, and it set the pattern for the rest of her life, in which the public adoration would never fail her even as her private happiness so often did. She arrived on a tide of love, and she would ride that tide, with grace and dignity, for more than 60 years, whatever storms ran beneath it. The wedding, in March 1863, was a strange and slightly mournful affair, for it was held in the shadow of Victoria's grief. The old queen, barely a year into her widowhood, would not allow a great public celebration. The ceremony took place not in London, but quietly at Windsor, with Victoria herself watching from a private gallery, dressed in black, more spectre than guest at her own son's wedding. The young Danish bride, just 18, married into a family still frozen in mourning, with a mother-in-law who was the most powerful and most formidable woman in the world. And here Alexandra's gift for gentle, dignified endurance served her well from the very first day. Victoria could be a difficult, demanding, possessive mother-in-law, forever finding fault, forever pulling her son's family into the orbit of her own needs. Alexandra navigated her with patience and warmth, never giving offense, slowly winning a real if complicated affection. It was, you might say, her first long lesson in waiting, for the approval of a queen who gave it grudgingly, and for a place of her own that would be 40 years in coming. England fell in love with her at once, and never really stopped. She was strikingly beautiful, with a slender grace and a gentle, dignified charm, and the public adored her from the moment she arrived. Hers was a beauty that the new age of photography carried into every parlor in the land, and unlike so many celebrated beauties of the era, she seemed to belong to the ordinary people who admired her. There was nothing cold or haughty in her loveliness, only a warm, almost wistful sweetness that made women want to copy her and men want to protect her. She kept her slim, youthful figure and her remarkable looks well into middle age, defying the years with a grace that astonished her contemporaries. But beauty, as so many of these stories quietly insist, is a thin shield against sorrow. The lovely face that England adored hid a heart that bore, year after year, the slights of a faithless husband, the losses of beloved children, and the slow closing in of her own deafness, and it hid them so well that the cheering crowds never guessed what their radiant princess was carrying behind her gentle smile. She had, too, a genuine sweetness, a real kindness, a love of children, a warmth that the cameras of the new photographic age carried into homes across the country. She set fashion simply by wearing them, and the women of England followed her devotedly. When an illness left her with a slight stiffness in one leg, fashionable ladies actually imitated her halting walk, the so-called Alexandra limp, copying the very wound she would surely rather have hidden. She favored high, jeweled collars and chokers worn close at the throat, and a generation of women copied those too, never knowing that she wore them in part to conceal a small scar from a childhood operation. Such was her power over the public imagination that even her flaws became fashions. She became one of the most photographed and admired women of the entire era, the picture of royal loveliness, her image multiplied endlessly in the shop windows and family albums of the age. And she gave Bertie children and made him, for a time, a home. From the outside, it looked like a fairy tale. It was not a fairy tale, because Bertie, for all his charm, was a serially, flagrantly unfaithful husband. The Prince of Wales kept a long succession of mistresses, actresses, society beauties, the famous and the merely available, and he did so with a lack of discretion that made his wife's humiliation a more or less public fact. Lily Langtry, whose story you may already know, was only the most celebrated of them. And Alexandra was expected to endure it all, the affairs, the gossip, the other women paraded through the social world she shared, with unbroken serenity and perfect dignity. And she did. She bore it with a composure that was, in its quiet way, magnificent, never making a public scene, keeping her grief and her anger behind that gentle, lovely, unreadable face. She channeled her love, above all, into her children, of whom she had 6, mothering them with a warmth and a hands-on affection rare among royalty. She played with them, indulged them, kept them close, and made of Sandringham something much nearer a real family home than the cold grandeur most royal children knew. She was famous, too, for a kind of charming, exasperating unpunctuality. She kept everyone waiting, serenely, all her life, as though time itself ought to defer to her, and somehow even this was forgiven her. And here is the most complicated truth of her marriage. For all his faithlessness, Bertie was, in his careless way, genuinely fond of her, and she of him. Theirs was not a cold marriage so much as a lopsided one, a warm, wandering, selfish husband and a loving, wounded, dignified wife, bound together by children and habit and a real if battered affection. When at last he lay dying, she even, with extraordinary generosity, summoned his final mistress to his bedside to say farewell. There is a whole world of swallowed pride and hard-won peace in that single gesture. And she carried her wounded pride, always, with a grace that only deepened the public's affection for her. It is one of the harder truths of her age, the same truth that runs through so many of these lives. A royal wife's feelings were simply not the point. Her duty was to endure beautifully. Alexandra endured more beautifully than almost anyone. Two private sorrows cut especially deep. The first was her health. In her early 20s, a severe illness left her with a permanent limp and, worse, with growing deafness, a hereditary deafness that deepened over the years until it cut her off, more and more, from the easy social chatter of the brilliant world she was supposed to adorn. Imagine the loneliness of it, beautiful, admired, surrounded always by people, and increasingly unable to hear them, marooned in a soft silence in the middle of every glittering room. As the years passed, the deafness deepened, until at the great dinners and receptions she could catch only fragments, smiling and nodding through conversations she could no longer follow, withdrawing more and more into her family and her few intimates, where the talk could be slow and close and kind. She bore even this with her characteristic grace, never complaining, never letting the frustration show, but it walled her off, year by year, from the brilliant social world she was born to adorn, and it deepened the gentle isolation that ran like a quiet river beneath her whole shining public life. The most adored woman in England spent her later years smiling beautifully into a silence almost no one around her ever quite understood. The second was grief. She lost a baby son in infancy, and years later her eldest son, Prince Albert Victor, known as Eddie, second in line to the throne, died young in an influenza epidemic, a loss from which her tender heart never fully recovered. She kept his room, as he had left it, much as her mother-in-law had kept Albert's. The two queens, so different, were sisters at least in this, in the keeping of shrines to the beloved dead. And yet, through all of it, she was never bitter, or never let it show, and that may be the most remarkable thing about her. When Queen Victoria finally died in 1901, Bertie became King Edward VII, and Alexandra, at last, after nearly 40 years of waiting in the wings, became queen. There is something almost unbearably poignant in that arithmetic. She had come to England a girl of 18, and she was a woman approaching 60 before she finally wore the crown she had married towards so long ago. Nearly 4 decades as Princess of Wales, the longest in British history, spent waiting, always waiting, for a throne that the long-lived old queen seemed in no hurry to vacate. The coronation itself was nearly derailed when the new king fell gravely ill and had to be operated on just days before it was postponed. The country held its breath, and then at last, in the summer of 1902, Alexandra was crowned beside her husband in Westminster Abbey, a beautiful, dignified, deaf, and patient queen who had earned her crown through nothing so much as the sheer grace of her endurance. She was a gracious and popular consort, beloved as ever, throwing herself into charitable work with real energy. She organized relief for the poor, supported hospitals and nurses, lent her name and her heart to 100 good causes. She had a deep, practical compassion for the sick and the suffering. She took a keen interest in nursing, championed the work of hospitals, and even involved herself in the medical care of the wounded. During the wars of her era, she threw herself into the cause of the soldiers, organizing and equipping medical aid, taking a real and informed interest in the new science of nursing that women like Florence Nightingale had dragged into respectability. She had a particular horror of needless suffering and a particular gift for the human touch, for visiting a sickbed, for remembering a name, for the small personal kindness that meant more than any grand gesture. In an age that asked royal women to be ornamental, Alexandra quietly insisted on being useful, and she did real good in the world with the strange, constrained power of a much-loved queen. She founded a great charitable effort that still bears her memory, the selling of little artificial roses each summer to raise money for the poor and the sick, a small bright tradition born of her tenderness. Her deafness, by now, had walled her into a soft and growing isolation even at the height of her queenship, so that she moved through the cheering crowds and the glittering ceremonies wrapped in her own quiet, smiling, gracious, beloved, and more alone than anyone watching could have guessed. She had a special, sheltering tenderness for her eldest son, Eddie, Prince Albert Victor, a gentle, dreamy, troubled young man who was second in line to the throne and the subject of endless worry and, after his early death, endless rumor. Whatever the truth of the shadows that gathered around his short life, to his mother he was simply her boy, and losing him broke something in her that never quite mended. She poured her love, increasingly, into her family circle and into her beloved Sandringham, the country house in Norfolk that was the family's true home, where she could be a mother and a grandmother rather than a queen on display. Her last years carried a particular sorrow that the wider world little noticed. Alexandra was Danish to her core, and she had never forgiven Prussia for seizing territory from her homeland in her youth. She distrusted Germany all her life. And then came the First World War, which tore straight through the great cousinhood that Victoria's marriages had woven across Europe, setting grandchildren and cousins against one another on opposing thrones, turning the family of nations into enemies. Alexandra lived through it as an old, deaf, widowed queen mother, watching the comfortable royal world of her prime be blown apart, her Russian sister's family, the Tsar, the Tsarina, their children, swept away entirely in the revolution, murdered, the bright cousins of her youth vanishing into history's darkest pages. When Edward died in 1910, after only 9 years on the throne, she had already become the dignified queen mother. Now she retired further and further from public life as her deafness and age closed in around her, living out her last years quietly at Sandringham, much loved, slowly fading from the bright world she had graced for half a century. She died in 1925, and was mourned as one of the best-loved royal figures the country had ever known. So as you grow drowsy, hold her gently in your mind. Alexandra had everything the world says a woman should want: beauty, a crown, the adoration of millions, a place at the very summit of royal life. And she spent her years enduring a faithless husband, a creeping deafness that walled her into silence, and the unbearable loss of her children, all behind a serene and lovely smile she was never permitted to drop. The most admired woman in England, and one of the loneliest. There is a lovely, sad symmetry in her story, and the one we opened with tonight. She was, in her way, the greatest lady-in-waiting of all, waiting nearly 40 years to be queen, waiting always for a husband whose attention wandered, waiting in a beautiful, deepening quiet, waiting out the long reign of a mother-in-law who would not let go of the throne. Her whole life was an act of waiting, performed with such grace that the world mistook it for serenity. She had beauty, fame, a crown, and the adoration of millions, and she spent her years enduring, gently, the things that would have broken a harder woman, and she never once let the watching public see the cost. And she did it with a grace that asked for nothing and won the love of a nation. There is a strength in that kind of endurance that the loud world rarely notices, and almost never rewards. But it was strength all the same. We are taught to admire the women who fought and shouted and broke things open, and we should. But there is another kind of courage, quieter and harder to see, in the woman who is handed a life of disappointment and bears it without bitterness, who keeps her dignity and her kindness intact through decades of private pain, who is wronged and does not become cruel, who waits and never lets the waiting sour her heart. Alexandra had that courage in full. She turned her own long endurance into gentleness toward others, her own loneliness into compassion for the suffering, and she was loved, in the end, not for her crown or even her famous beauty, but for the grace with which she carried a life that had given her so much less than it promised. That, too, is a kind of greatness. The world is just slower to call it by that name. Long before she was an old princess and the dignified patron of 100 good causes, she was simply Louise, the beautiful, willful, artistic fourth daughter of Queen Victoria, the rebel of the royal nursery, the one who would not be married off to a foreign prince, who took up sculpture as a serious art, who moved among Bohemian painters, and who spent her long life quietly straining against the gilded bars that her mother, of all people, had built around her. Of all Victoria's 9 children, Louise is the one who most refused to simply do as she was told. She was born in 1848, in the middle of that vast royal brood, and from early on she stood out, livelier, prettier, more willful, more artistic than her sisters, with a streak of independence that her watchful mother regarded with deep suspicion. The royal nursery was a crowded, regulated little kingdom of its own, presided over by Albert's earnest theories of education and Victoria's exacting eye, and the 9 children were sorted, almost from infancy, into their expected roles: the dutiful ones, the clever ones, the difficult ones. Louise was marked early as a handful, too restless, too imaginative, too quick to question and to charm her way around the rules. She did not take naturally to the meek obedience expected of a princess. She wanted to draw, to make, to move, to be noticed for herself, and the careful machinery of royal upbringing, designed to produce serviceable dynastic brides, had no real idea what to do with a girl like that. The friction began young, and it never entirely stopped. For Queen Victoria, having escaped her own cage, built a remarkably strict one for her daughters. The princesses were educated carefully but conventionally, kept close, and expected, above all, to be useful and obedient, and after Albert's death, several of them found themselves pressed into service as their grieving mother's unpaid secretaries and companions, their own lives subordinated entirely to her endless mourning. To be a daughter of Queen Victoria was, in many ways, to be the most exalted lady-in-waiting of all, trapped at her side, attending to her needs, your own wishes a distant irrelevance. Louise chafed against this more than any of them. She wanted air. She wanted art. She wanted a life. The years after Albert's death were especially hard for the royal daughters, and they fell heaviest on whichever girl was unmarried and at home. One by one the sisters took turns as their mother's confidential secretary and companion, chained to her grief, reading her correspondence, soothing her moods. Their own youth poured into the bottomless well of her mourning. Louise served her stint, and hated the confinement of it with a quiet fury, even as she performed the duty. She had also, in her childhood, known sorrow up close. Her youngest brother, Leopold, suffered from hemophilia, the cruel bleeding disease their mother had unknowingly passed down, and the sight of that fragile, much-loved boy shadowed the nursery. Louise grew up clever, restless, and quietly rebellious, a beauty with a sharp tongue and a hunger for something the palace could not give her, and she began to look for it in art. And remarkably, she carved one out. Her gift was real. Louise was a genuinely talented artist, above all a sculptor, with far more ability than royal daughters were ever supposed to possess or display. She did not merely dabble in the ladylike accomplishment of a little drawing. She trained seriously, studied under professional artists, worked in clay and marble, and became a sculptor of real and recognized skill. Her statue of her own mother, Queen Victoria, still stands today at Kensington Palace, where Victoria's own caged childhood had unfolded, made by the hand of the daughter who most resembled her in spirit, and good enough to hold its place in public for well over a century. She exhibited her work, including at the Royal Academy, the most prestigious art institution in the land, where it was judged not as a princess's charming hobby, but on its own real merits. She designed and modeled memorials and portrait busts. She worked in the company of professional artists, and took their criticism, and learned her craft as seriously as any of them. For a woman of her rank to do this at all was faintly scandalous. Daughters of queens were meant to embroider, and sketch prettily, and marry, not to dirty their hands with clay and chisel and ambition. Louise did not care. Art was the one realm in which she was free to be judged for what she could do rather than what she had been born, and she guarded that freedom fiercely, the one corner of her gilded life that was entirely, defiantly her own. Through her art Louise moved into a wider, freer, more bohemian world than any princess was meant to know, mixing with working artists and sculptors, breathing the comparatively unbuttoned air of the studio. She had progressive sympathies, too. She supported the cause of women's education and women's rights, lent her name and her energy to the founding of colleges and schools for women, and believed, quietly but firmly, that women's lives ought to be larger than the narrow rooms her century allotted them. She studied under real working sculptors, including the well-known artist Edgar Boehm, in whose studio she spent a great deal of time, and to whom rumor, then and ever since, linked her romantically, one of many whispers that trailed the unconventional princess through her life. Whatever the truth of it, the studio was her escape hatch, the one place where she was not a princess on display, but an artist among artists, her hands in the clay, judged by what she could make rather than whom she had been born. She put her position to real use, too. She became an active patron of the movement for women's higher education, supporting the new colleges that were, against fierce resistance, beginning to open the life of the mind to women, and lending the weight of a royal name to a cause her mother regarded with deep distaste. For Queen Victoria, famously, had little patience for what she called the mad, wicked folly of women's rights, and here was her own daughter, quietly funding the future. She was, in short, about the least conventional princess imaginable. Her relationship with her formidable mother was, as you might guess, a complicated and often stormy one. Victoria found Louise difficult, too clever, too willful, too quick with an opinion, too obviously straining against the role she had been given, and the two strong women clashed repeatedly across the years. And there is a deep irony in it that you, standing in the cold court tonight, can feel keenly, that the queen who had escaped her own suffocating childhood cage went on to build cages of duty and convention around her own daughters, and that Louise, the brightest and most rebellious of them, spent her life pushing against bars built by a mother who had once pushed against bars of her own. Privilege, it turns out, is not the same thing as freedom. Louise had palaces and jewels and a great name, and almost no power at all over the actual shape of her days, whom she might see, where she might go, what she might do with the one wild and artistic life she had been given. She was rich beyond imagining and unfree in nearly every way that mattered to her, and she knew it, and it galled her all her life. That hunger to be more than an ornament, to make something, to mean something, to be allowed simply to be a whole person, is the thread that runs through her whole restless story. Her marriage was the most startling thing of all. When the time came for Louise to wed, she flatly declined the usual fate of a royal daughter, shipment abroad to marry some minor German prince, sight largely unseen, for reasons of dynastic bookkeeping. Instead, with her mother's surprising and hard-won consent, she married a British subject, John Campbell, the Marquis of Lorne, heir to the Duke of Argyll, a nobleman, certainly, but not a royal, a near commoner by the rigid standards of royal matchmaking. It was the first time in centuries that a daughter of a reigning British monarch had married outside the closed circle of royalty, and it caused a sensation. Louise had chosen, on her own terms, a marriage that pleased her, to a cultivated, handsome man who moved in the same artistic and intellectual circles she loved. It looked, for a moment, like freedom. The wedding, in 1871, was a glittering national occasion, and for a moment Louise seemed to have managed the impossible. A princess who had married for something like her own reasons to a cultivated man of her own world. The Marquis of Lorne was handsome, literary, well-traveled, and moved easily among the artists and writers Louise loved. On paper, they were beautifully matched. It did not bring her the happiness she hoped for. The marriage, though it endured for decades, was not a warm or fruitful one. The couple had no children, the only one of Victoria's married children to have none, and over the years they grew distant, often living largely separate lives, coming together for public duties and drifting apart in private. There was no great public scandal, no divorce, for such a thing was unthinkable for a daughter of the Queen. Instead, there was the quieter, sadder arrangement so common among the unhappy couples of her class, a marriage maintained on the surface, for the sake of appearances and duty, while each partner found what life and companionship they could elsewhere. Louise poured herself into her art and her causes and her travels, her husband into his own pursuits and circle. They remained, in name and in public, the Marquis and his royal wife, and in private something much lonelier. It was, in its own muted way, the same lesson the whole evening keeps teaching, that even the boldest bid for freedom, in that world, tended to deliver a more comfortable cage rather than the open sky. There were persistent whispers, then and since, about the true nature of the marriage and about where each partner's affections really lay. Louise herself was the subject of any number of rumors of romances and flirtations, for she was beautiful, charming, and temperamentally incapable of the meek invisibility expected of her. Whatever the private truth, and biographers have speculated endlessly, some suggesting that her husband's deepest affections lay elsewhere, with men rather than with her. The storybook escape had not delivered a storybook ending. Even the most rebellious princess of the age found that the cage had simply changed its shape. But she did not let an unhappy marriage define her, and that is the heart of her. She kept working, kept sculpting, kept her own circle and her own interests through all the long decades. Her art remained genuine and respected. She produced portraits and figures and public monuments, and after the carnage of the First World War she lent her hand and her name to memorials for the dead, including work commemorating the soldiers who fell, a princess literally shaping the nation's grief in stone. She remained a patron of art schools and of the cause of women's advancement, quietly steadfast in the convictions her mother had despised. She kept apartments at Kensington Palace, the very place where her mother's caged childhood had unfolded, and lived there, increasingly the grand old lady of the royal family, a living relic of a vanished age, still independent of mind, still faintly scandalous in the memory of those who recalled her youth. There was, however, a genuine adventure in the middle of it. When her husband was appointed Governor-General of Canada, Louise crossed the Atlantic and spent several years as the viceregal consort of that vast young country, and she left a real mark on it. The province of Alberta is named in her honor, Alberta, after her own middle name, Louise Caroline Alberta, and so is Lake Louise, that famous jewel of turquoise water cradled among the snow peaks of the Rocky Mountains, ringed by glaciers, one of the most breathtaking and most photographed places in all of Canada. Imagine it, a quiet alpine lake of impossible blue-green, fed by glacial meltwater, mirror still beneath the mountains, drawing travelers from across the world to stand in silent wonder at its edge. And it carries the name of a Victorian princess who spent her girlhood longing to escape the cold, hushed corridors of her mother's palaces. Of all the monuments a royal life might leave, hers is among the loveliest. Not a statue or a tomb, but a wild and shining lake at the edge of the world, beautiful and free in a way she herself was so rarely allowed to be. There is something rather wonderful in that. The restless, artistic princess, who longed all her life for wider horizons, has her name attached forever to one of the wildest and most beautiful landscapes on earth, half a world away from the cold, hushed palaces of her girlhood. Her years in Canada were not without their trials. There was a serious sleighing accident that injured her and shadowed her health for a time, and the long Canadian winters and the formal viceregal duties wore on her. But she traveled the young country, sketched its scenery, encouraged its artists, and lent her energy to the founding of institutions of art and learning there, leaving a cultural mark that outlasted her stay. For a woman who had spent her girlhood longing for air, the vast Canadian sky must have been, for all its hardships, a kind of answer. She traveled, she painted, she sculpted, she supported her causes, and she lived, on the whole, a freer and more interesting life than any of her royal sisters. She lived a very long time, long enough to see the entire world of her mother's court pass away. She survived into the 20th century, into the age of motor cars and airplanes and the First World War, dying in 1939 on the very eve of the second, at the age of 91, one of the last living links to the vanished Victorian age into which she had been born. By the end of her long life, she had outlived her mother by nearly 40 years, outlived her husband, outlived almost all her brothers and sisters, outlived the entire vanished world of crinolines and mourning courts and Highland servants into which she had been born. She had seen Victoria's grandson on the throne, then his sons. She had watched the horse give way to the motor car and the aeroplane, the gaslight to the electric bulb, the certainties of her century crumble into the anxious modern age. In her last years she was a frail, grand, dignified old lady in her apartments at Kensington, attended by a new generation of ladies-in-waiting who could scarcely imagine the world she remembered, the daughter of a queen who had died before they were born. And to the very end she kept her independence of mind, her love of art, and her quiet refusal to be merely what a princess was supposed to be. So let her be the last face you see tonight as you drift down towards sleep. Louise had everything and was permitted, really, to control almost none of it. A princess, an artist, a rebel, gilded and constrained in the same breath, who fought all her life, gently and stubbornly, for a little more room than her century wished to allow her. She did not break free, exactly. No woman of her world entirely could. But she pushed at the bars harder than almost anyone, made real art with her own hands, married whom she chose, supported the slow widening of other women's lives, and left her name on a lake of impossible blue at the edge of the wilderness. And perhaps that is the most hopeful note to carry down towards sleep, that even in the most rigid and gilded of cages, a determined soul can make a little more room, can keep one corner of life entirely her own, can refuse, quietly and stubbornly, to be only what the world has decided she must be. Louise never tore the bars down. No woman of her century could. But she made art with her own hands. She married whom she chose. She crossed an ocean and left her name on a wilderness. She funded the slow widening of other women's lives, and she lived to 91, exactly as much herself as her age would permit, and a good deal more than it wished. Of all the women in the gilded cage tonight, she is the one who, finding the door locked, simply made the cage a little larger from the inside, and called, again and again, for the windows to be opened. And there our journey ends for tonight. We began the evening as a lady-in-waiting, standing in the cold a few feet behind the throne, and we leave it in the company of 3 women who lived at the very heart of that quiet, glittering, gilded world. Victoria, who ruled an empire and mourned a husband for 40 years. Alexandra, who endured with a grace the world never deserved. And Louise, who pushed at the bars and called for the windows to be opened. Each of them at the summit of their age. Each of them, in her own way, waiting. So let the great palace grow quiet now. Let the candles in the long corridors gutter and go dark, one by one. Let the cold rooms empty, and the curtsies cease, and the endless waiting finally end. There is nothing left for you to do tonight, and no one left to attend. You may, at last, simply rest. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders sink down into the pillows. Let the warm dark settle over you like a blanket drawn up to your chin. The whole grand, hushed, glittering world can wait until morning. It always does. And if your mind drifts, as it falls, back through the cold corridors we wandered tonight, past the patient ladies standing in the candlelight, past the small woman in black at the heart of it all, past the beautiful deaf queen and the rebel princess with clay on her hands, let it drift gently, without holding on. These were real women, every one of them, who lived their long days, and carried their quiet sorrows, and are at rest now, as you soon will be. There is a strange comfort in that, in the dark, that all the waiting ends, that all the grand and gilded lives wound down at last to silence and sleep, just as your own busy day is winding down now toward the same soft place. Sleep now. Rest easy, wherever you are, whatever the hour. And when you're ready, drift off gently into your own quiet dreams. I'll be here again tomorrow night, with another story from the soft, candlelit past, to keep you company in the dark. Until then, sweet dreams.